Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply. In this video is to bring you a closer look at the Jackson number 20902. This is what they call a G-type side load. I'd call it an end load. Bottom pivot set. That's what it looks like in the package. Let's take it out and see why they call it a side load. I would know this as an end load. The reason we would know it as an end load is because you will it's obviously going to look like that. The adjustment that we're going to have is via this threaded bolt that will allow us to adjust the bearing packet that's here. You don't get a whole lot of adjustment on this, but you do get some. Side load, well, obviously you're going to have to install this into the bottom of the door and then put the door down on top of the floor plate and then tip it into place. A side load really would have, in my experience, would have a notch in the face of the door, and rather than tip the door onto the bottom pivot, you would just basically be able to load it from the side or from the face of the door, and there would be a cover plate on the outside of that. Or there's an end load where there's a notch made in the edge of the door. This is certainly not an end load unit because of this adjusting bolt that's here. Okay. So let's take a look at the installation instructions and see what those are all about. These are linked to down below this video so that you can review along with me. Okay, when we look at the installation instructions, they're talking about the bottom door rail. The bottom door rail, drill and tap 1/4 holes in bottom rail of door. So for these two slotted areas, drill and tap 2 1/4 holes such that the hinge, the edge of the door, the hinge style of the door to the center of the pivot bearing retainer is 2 5/8. So before you drill and tap any holes, figure out where that's going to be placed so that you've got some center line on the two slotted holes to give you 2 5/8 from the edge of the door. Okay. Install, once you have that handled, then install your pivot bearing retainer plate with 2 1/4 5/8 truss head machine screw and the lock washers. They are not lock washers, they're star washers that are right there. Okay. So get that positioned, mark, drill and tap, and then attach. Okay. Once you know that you have it positioned correctly, you would be able to drill and install your final screw into this permanent hole. However, they are not giving you a bolt for that middle hole. That would be the one I'd certainly want to use to prevent any movement, is what I would like to do. Okay. This is the bottom floor portion. They call it the pivot bearing retainer. This, via this bolt, permits a 1/4 inch adjustment. When I draw this screw, it will force this triangular shaped piece of metal on the inside to force that pivot down, pushing the door up. You should be able to see that draw in, which it is. I can tell that my pivot bearing is coming down. And they say that it's a 1/4 inch adjustment. There's another unit here there's another piece of documentation that says it's 3/8 of an inch. It's certainly no more than a 1/4 inch that I can tell. The important part of using this G-type is that you have the 1 9/16 inverted bottom channel to allow for this to safely fit inside of the bottom channel of the aluminum door. Let's take some dimensions. Overall is about 1 1/8 inches. Overall length of the body, about 5.5, with the width of about 1 5/16 inches. So you've got to make sure that you've got 1 9/16. If you don't have that sort of inverted bottom channel, and if you have less, that's probably not the right pivot. If you have more, I don't see why you couldn't shim the top of this. So keep that in mind, that that may work for you as well. I would sure be real tempted to try to get a screw up in here as well by removing that, although it's not intended to come apart, remove that bolt. These three here should be quite adequate, but I would certainly put a screw in the center. I'd come up with a 1/4-20 bolt once I knew I was in the perfect sort of position. Okay. Now, floor mount pivot. I had shown it like this earlier. It's meant to go like this. This flat portion goes against your jamb. So center the floor plate against the door jamb on the hinge side. Okay. Center it in the depth of the frame as well, or at least make sure that it's center with the, it needs to be plumb with the top pivot point is the bottom line. Okay. According to the installation instructions, 2 5/8 is where you'll locate from the edge of the door to the center line of this, and you'll obviously want to make sure that that lines up with what's being done in the header. Center floor plate against the door jamb on the hinge side. Mark and drill 1/4-20 holes, 1.5 inches deep in floor for plastic expansion plugs. You'll get 3 what appear to be number 12 by 1.25 inch flat head threaded to the head wood screws. Plastic anchors as well. I might be real tempted to skip over all of that and use a machine screw and a lead anchor if possible. A plastic anchor. I wouldn't hang a door with a plastic anchor, but that's what they send you. Partially why the cost is so reasonable. When using a threshold, drill a 1/2 inch hole for the clearance of the floor plate stud, 2 3/4 on center line from the hinge edge of threshold. So what they're saying is, from this place to the center line, which should be 2 3/4 inch, which does appear to be the case. Okay, that would account for an 1/8 inch margin from the jamb to the edge of the door, where this is 2 5/8. Okay, this should be 1/8 inch greater. Prep your thresholds so that the threshold can sit down over this is the point. Okay. Let's go over some dimensions of this. Overall length of the plate, about 4 1/16. Overall width out here, about 2 7/8. Down here at the end, you can see it's going to be closer to about 1 3/8 inches. Height of that spindle from the floor is going to be about 1 3/8 inches. Accommodate your threshold. They go on to say if you are installing the pivot stud into a threshold, that you would literally install that stud into the threshold. This model will not accommodate that. You can't remove this spindle stud out and then thread it into a threshold alone. If you're using a threshold, your threshold will have to go down and over this. Okay. Now, the installation instructions, in my opinion, don't really give you all of the details necessary, because you might say, well, what maximum undercut can I work with? There is a link also below this video to a document called Technical Information, and that gives you some additional information, bottom, left of center, that will show you that you need to be 2 1/4 inch from the floor to the top of this plate when it's installed. 2 1/4 inch. So I've got that adjusted all the way out at its maximum. So if I split that in the center, meaning if I drew the pivot bearing in, I'd get my 2 1/4, and if I took it all the way, I'd probably get to 2 1/8. That's pretty spot on right there. So that's the important portion. You know by looking at, let's hold it upside down. You can kind of study where everything needs to be. From the bottom of the door, pardon me, from the floor to the underside of the inverted channel, 2 1/4 when you're accounting for this. Then we can measure the rest of this, and you'll determine exactly what sort of preparation you would need to do in a threshold, assuming that you're using one. I'm sure that you would be. The 2 5/8 dimension is also illustrated there in an elevation view, which is very helpful. This G-mount bottom pivot is used in their overhead concealed door closer with a side load arm, and that's really where the reference to side load arm is going to come into play. When you look at the reference to side load arm, you'll notice in the arm itself that goes up into the header, there's a notch in the face of the arm that you would then put your door down here and then tip it up into place, and then take the block with its machine screws and tighten it to the edge of the drilled and tapped arm, and that's where side load comes from. There's nothing side load about the bottom pivot. The side load references to the top pivot for this application. So if you have an existing application and everything you need lines up with the requirements of the dimensional requirements, I should say, of this pivot, by looking at not only the installation instructions but the technical information as well, then you're in a perfect position, actually. Finally, there's a link below this video to the manufacturer's page where you can pull up not only all of the Jackson products that we sell, but a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to the full product catalog. Now, the name Jackson is a name that is no longer just Jackson. That name is actually owned by C.R. Lawrence, whose name is synonymous with architectural hardware that will certainly include pivot hardware, overhead door closers, both concealed, obviously, and surface mounted. The name C.R. Lawrence is quite synonymous when it comes to glass shower enclosure hardware, like pivots and push and pull bars, all of the hardware necessary to install that material. If you were to go to the manufacturer's page, bottom right of center, click manufacturers, at least currently, and scroll down to C.R. Lawrence, you'll see several and many product catalogs, several dozen in fact, that will show you all of the top level categories of material that C.R. Lawrence does. Any questions on the C.R. Lawrence 20902G style bottom pivot set or any other C.R. Lawrence product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.